Thanks very much. Thanks for the invitation. I was still at university. I was in my second year as an undergraduate when Blair became leader of the party. So I was a couple of years out of university for the '97 election. Then I headed the Fabian Society for sort of 7 years at the end of New Labour. But British Future is a charity. It's a non-partisan think tank that looks at issues of identity. So I'll try and rise above the fray a bit here and talk about identity. And New Labour, New Britain was a party project and a national project. I think 12 years after that ended, the electoral political achievement might look stronger because it hasn't been emulated. The national legacy looks different than it would have done in 2010 when David Cameron and Nick Clegg were coming in for their coalition, and maybe looks weaker than it did as well, but it's continuing to change. And the political axes may be shifted from some of the big economic questions of tax and spend and public services onto these questions of identity. So I want to give you a quick whistle-stop tour of the sort of complex identity legacy of New Labour. The biggest one, I think, is a much more consciously multinational United Kingdom today than we had 25 years ago. The St George's flags had come out at Wembley Stadium in '96 for that football tournament, but it was the New Labour government and devolution to Scotland and Wales, peace in Northern Ireland, that in England, as well as in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, people started to understand that the United Kingdom, that Britain, it was a civic shared identity of a multinational state. Otherwise, people would have talked about England and Britain as exactly the same thing. So that will endure in many ways, but it's an unfinished story. Scottish Labour, for example, is one of the victims of the new politics of Scotland since the referendum. But that will be a big shift. It's an unfinished project because New Labour's idea about power in England was rejected in the North East devolution referendum, and they didn't come up with another one. So it's still an asymmetric sort of non-settled settlement, but it's a very big change that is playing out. The second legacy, New Britain, what does that mean? A more liberal society. Sarah Childs talked to us about the shift of women in Parliament, a very big shift overnight on that day that then resonated across the parties. I think the shift on sexuality in attitudes got much stronger and much faster over those decades. If you go and watch the election result night count in Exeter, when Ben Bradshaw was being elected after an utterly homophobic campaign against him. But the things that are said to Ben Bradshaw by his Conservative opponent won't be said by mainstream right or mainstream left or centre candidates again, because that has shifted. So there's a really sustained legacy on a more liberal society, and it actually gives us, people on the left don't always notice this, gives us more moderate, more middling culture wars in Britain than you have in America or in France, actually, because some of those big shifts on the role of women, on sexuality, are not still up for grabs. You're not going to see the abolition of abortion in Britain, for example. You're having that debate in America, but you're still having sort of the British culture wars, slightly moderate, slightly middling, because in a way this New Britain argument didn't quite land as well. The Dome was an iconic failure. It was a once-in-a-thousand-year story about Britain, but it didn't have anything in it or anything to say. You can learn quite a lot from thinking about why did the Dome fail and the London Olympics actually work, actually. And it was partly New Labour's failure. It was a sort of suspension of disbelief wasn't there, but it's partly because that future, not the past. If you have no past to tell your future story, you don't actually have a future story. Whereas if what Danny Boyle did in that opening ceremony was he told the sort of story of 1,000 years of history turning into modern Britain. So it was New Labour was trying to be inclusive, but it didn't quite land it as much as it did. Gordon Brown was going to do a lot more. I chaired his big conference and speech on Britishness at the Vane site. He was going to say a lot more about Britishness, identity, values, a new constitutional settlement. We had the financial crash and none of that quite happened. So again, sort of quite big changes, but not quite sort of a finished job. Race was different, I think, to the other issues. A more complex, maybe a more divisive debate about race arose. New Labour didn't think very much about race. It was quite peripheral to its project compared to gender. There were reasons for that. I mean, it had an electoral problem with women votes. It didn't have an electoral problem with ethnic minorities. About 3/4 of those who voted were voting for it. The suburbs are now quite diverse in 2021. Middle England wasn't as diverse in 1997, and so if you're going for sort of Mondeo man, you sort of you would sort of had that on your side already. And also New Labour was quite a Scandinavian project in its sort of first knockings. It was the red, green, social democracy and so on. So race didn't really figure. So race turns up for New Labour in ways it's not expecting. And way to show how it didn't figure. I mean, the number of ethnic minority MPs after the 97 election was 9, up from 6. There was only 4 of the new MPs. Actually, there were no, people are very surprised to hear this now, there were no Asian women in Parliament ever in the House of Commons until May 2010. At the end, when half a dozen Asian women are elected, Roshnara Ali in East London, Shabana Mahmood in Birmingham, Priti Patel comes in, Home Secretary now, but there'd never been an Asian woman in Parliament until she got in. So that surge is actually after New Labour. But race is still quite an important theme for New Labour because agendas come onto it. So it does something really important with the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. With Jack Straw, I think, deserves a lot of credit. It's kind of 25 years ago, 30 years ago, the murder. Nearly 25 years now, the Macpherson report in 1999. So it's a sort of George Floyd moment for the British race debate, but it actually takes 4 years after the murder to have the inquiry and 6 years to have its account. And I think it's a profoundly important moment. New Labour did something that doesn't seem very New Labour in having that inquiry. And so they did it because of the breadth of the coalition that was behind it. You had the Lawrences, a very powerful campaign. You had radical lawyers, probably some Marxists in there. You had the Black Left. You had New Labour and Jack Straw. You had Paul Dacre's Daily Mail. And actually, if Paul Dacre's Daily Mail hadn't been in favour of that, I don't know if New Labour would have done it. Some papers have come out where, they're a bit worried, will it be a bit anti-police to do this, and so on. But it's an important moment, and we'll reflect, I think, next year and the year after on the things that didn't happen. But it starts a new race debate in Britain because Middle England sees a story about policing and the experience of a black family and a black victim that, is very familiar to the black community, but Middle England hadn't heard about. That was important. But then the race debate changes because of the 2001 disturbances in northern towns and the Campbell Report, Parallel Lives, segregation. So New Labour starts to think through its kind of vague multiculturalism or post-multiculturalism, and it changes again because of 9/11 and 7/7. And so you then have quite an intense debate about integration, segregation, overly focused in some ways on British Muslims and British Muslim integration. And Tony Blair, at the end of his time, he gives quite a thoughtful, I think, legacy lecture on integration to the Runnymede Trust on the way out. And really, he's regretting that he hasn't really got hold of this issue of integration. We've never really had integration policies from British governments of any party, and New Labour's thinking about it but doesn't quite get there. It did citizenship ceremonies, which I think are very important ways to sort of how do people become British, migrant integration, ethnic minority patriotism and so on, but it was more symbolic than real. The fourth important identity legacy is a loss of public confidence in immigration in Britain. And, New Labour is quite pro-immigration. It's probably in Polly's list of, not making the public case or making it badly, making it about economics. New Labour is very focused on asylum and refugee issues and very familiar debates still. They're quite tough in their language. They pass a lot of laws. They declare the Home Office not fit for purpose many times, but it's quite hard to get it right. As Caroline Flint was saying, that they're firm but fair. They're tough on illegal immigration. They're a bit blind, as the Conservatives were afterwards, to what so-called hostile environment policies might do for people who have rights in Britain, such as the Windrush generation, the Windrush scandal. That actually starts under New Labour. So it's quite a hard thing to get right, having rules and fairness, but applying them fairly, especially if you have a government department that doesn't work. But New Labour's biggest legacy on immigration turns out to be a decision that was not much debated at the time. I think the 2004 decision of accession. Britain decides, I think, because it will be good for the economy and it will be good generally to have, not to take a 7-year delay on EU accession and EU migration, and that that does well for GDP. But they don't know that all of the other European countries aren't doing it. We now know, with the benefit of hindsight, that you would still have had quite a lot of Polish migration to Britain, but you would have had it a bit slower and a bit later. You might not have had the referendum you had, and it might have had a different result. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't have had the migration from Eastern Europe. But if you were going to have it, you needed to manage it better, prepare for it, plan for it, make it fair for the people who came and the communities they joined. And ironically, post-Brexit Britain, British Future does a lot of work on this, post-Brexit Britain is now much more relaxed about immigration than Britain was in 2014 and 2016, a sense of regret for the Remainers in the room, some control for the you know, for some of the Leavers, the more moderate Leavers. A sense of catharsis. People can't say we can't talk about the issue, change the system. But New Labour's failure to handle the pace of change better actually turned out to be very costly for it. And that's my final New Labour legacy is the loss of the argument that it wanted to make about Britain in the world, and the loss of the argument about a European Britain. Tony Blair is quite a cakeist politician when it comes to international. He doesn't want to choose America or Europe or the Commonwealth. He wants all of them, perfectly good position. But he has to choose over Iraq. He's quite multilateralist about his New World Order with Bill Clinton after 9/11, but he tries to make that work with George Bush, and it doesn't go well for him, and you get Iraq, and you get a loss of trust. But what he's also going to do is he's going to settle the argument for a European Britain. He's planning to, on September the 11th, 2001, make a speech to the TUC where he really gears up his campaign to get Britain to join the Euro and to have a referendum about that. So if you think about the ambition he had and where it ended up, it's surely in his own terms his biggest failure. Gordon Brown isn't keen on the Euro. That gets stopped. New Labour becomes a more sort of stay-in Eurosceptic government. So is Brexit itself a legacy of New Labour? I think that would be unfair. David Cameron calls the referendum. George Osborne has the economy. The Osborne-Cameron government sets it up. But New Labour lays quite a lot of the seeds, actually, for that lost argument that it regrets. It's doing very well with graduates, Will, and it wins the referendum with the graduates, probably about 3-1. But it just can't make the argument it wants to make to the non-graduates as well as the graduates. That big dip in turnout in 2001, some of those people vote for the first time. They vote in 1997 and they vote in 2016 to leave the European Union. So something big goes wrong for New Labour in its international argument. It's made a case that Britain is more engaged. It's made the case in Warsaw. It's made the case in Paris, and it's made the case in Brussels. And it hasn't really taken the argument to Wolverhampton, to Peterborough, and to Birmingham. And so I think New Labour's legacy will continue to shift depending on what happens to the United Kingdom, depending on what happens to Brexit Britain. But I think this is the big reason that the answers that New Labour was looking for in 1997 are answers to different questions that British governments of any party or the next Labour government will face in the 2020s. Thanks.